For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe. My name is Joe Brewer. I grew up on a chicken farm in Missouri, one of those nasty, terrible industrial chicken farms. But it just happens I was born the same year that the first Bioregional Congress of the Ozarks was being organized. And some of you who are a little bit more familiar with the movement will know that in the 1980s, Cascadia and the Ozarks were two of the places with the best organized bioregional movements. And so I grew up in the Ozarks in southwest Missouri, in the Ozarks Plateau, the land of caves, because it's a 450 million year old sandstone structure with beautiful underwater rivers and springs and 8,000 registered caves in the state of Missouri. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I just wanted your attention. So I don't want to talk too much about myself. I just want to say I chose to be a father with eyes wide open about the state of the world. I spent about 10 years deciding whether or not to bring a child into the future that I saw coming. So that's my claim to legitimacy, if I have any at all. Because somewhere along the way, I decided that I needed to believe in the future of humanity rather than accept the extinction of our species. And in that place, I chose to put skin in the game. And the skin is wrapped around the body of my little girl. That's my claim to legitimacy. So, what I want to talk to you about is what's written up here. How do we regenerate Cascadia? Now, I want to go through these words because I'm also trained as a cognitive linguist, so I'm really interested in words and the concepts and their meanings. So I want you to notice that this is not, do we regenerate Cascadia? I'm presuming the answer is yes. It's how. How do we? So I want to talk about how. I want to talk about how we organize ourselves so that we could regenerate the Cascadia bioregion, which more or less is the Cascade Mountain Range together with the Salish Sea, together with the basin of drainage of the entire Columbia River. It's huge. Like 430 rivers. It's huge. And so we're talking about the scale of the problem that requires a scale of solution that most people are not ready to dream. And so, regenerate. How do we regenerate Cascadia? Regenerate implies regeneration, and regeneration is the dynamic process of any living system to continually, moment to moment, reproduce the conditions of being alive. Just like the type of lizard that drops its tail and grows its tail back, or the starfish that loses one of its arms and regenerates its arm. But look at my skin. All of the skin you see is dead. It's dead cells, because there's subcutaneous tissue pushing out into these flakes that fall off, and every 30 days I regenerate the most important membrane on my body, my skin. Regeneration is the moment-to-moment recreation of the conditions of being alive. So to regenerate Cascadia, when Cascadia is this massive tapestry of landscapes, is to work in harmony with the living systems of Cascadia so that we can moment to moment reproduce the conditions conducive to life. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is a big conversation. I want to start the conversation with a point that many other people have made, but I want to make it again because it's so important. If you look at the Earth from space, you'll notice the complete absence of boundaries. They're not there. They don't exist. Nation states are a fiction. The boundaries that divide us are in our minds. But when you look at the Earth, you see something different. You see an integrated, holistic, interdependent system, a single holistic system. I mean, just look at the water. There's water over 71% of the surface of the Earth in the ocean. But then on land, you've got lakes and rivers. And then in the air, you have clouds. And where there are no clouds, there's water vapor. There's not a single pixel in this image without water. Water integrates everything. There's even water pulled down in our subduction zones deep into the magma of the molten rock that shoots out with volcanoes. Water even goes into the center, into the middle part of the earth. It's integrated into the whole system. And a holistic system like this creates a context of interdependencies that gives rise to systemic risk. So we need to understand the nature of the systemic risk that we're in to see why the bioregional scale is the minimum level of intervention to address it. Then actually nothing smaller will work. And I want to explain how that is. So, to begin, it really helps to start with a shared understanding of where we are and why we need to do this work. So I want to ask, just for the show of hands, who here has heard of the planetary boundaries? So about half, a little less than half of you. So the planetary boundaries is a really helpful way of seeing where we are. So the planetary boundaries is the answer to a very interesting question. It was a question asked by the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is a collaboration of about 3,500 Earth system scientists, people who study different parts of the dynamic Earth. And back in 2009, they asked a very interesting question. They said, with everything we know about the dynamic Earth, are there any thresholds for any of the processes of the Earth that if we crossed that threshold, we would leave the warm, stable climate known as the Holocene that has existed for the last 12,000 years, and then we would call into question the ability to have permanent human settlements, large-scale agriculture, empires, civilizations, global supply chains? Are there thresholds of the Earth that if we cross them, we would leave the safe operating space for humanity? So then they went and gathered in conferences and research, papers were presented, and they identified that there are 9. There are 9 planetary boundaries that if we cross even one, we leave the safe operating space for humanity. And here they are. Climate change is only one of them. Climate change gets all the talk these days, but right next to climate change is biosphere integrity, which is a way of saying the rate of extinction. Because if you cause too many extinctions, you create fragility in ecosystems and they collapse. So this is the measure of the mass extinction event that is starting to occur. Then there's land system change. Land system change means you destroy intact ecosystems and replace them with degraded landscapes, like agriculture, like cities, like deserts. Then there's freshwater use, because only 1% of the water in the world is freshwater. 99% is salt water. And if that fresh water is contaminated, or if it's not available, then our complex societies go away. Then there's biogeochemical flows, specifically chemically reactive nitrogen and phosphorus used in industrial fertilizers. That when you overuse them, they run off into our rivers, run off into our oceans, and create what are called apoxic zones, where there's no oxygen, and they kill the marine ecosystems, causing a collapse of the food chain in the world ocean. Then there's ocean acidification. If the ocean becomes too acidic, calcium carbonate begins to dissolve. Calcium carbonate is the chemical for making coral in coral reefs. It's also the chemical that's used for making bones of clams and other shelled creatures in the ocean. They start to dissolve. Atmospheric aerosol loading, which is just a fancy way of saying air pollution. There's too much air pollution. Stratospheric ozone depletion, because in the stratosphere of the atmosphere, there's an ozone layer that absorbs the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. But if that ultraviolet radiation got to the Earth, it would kill all life on our continents. All of the land-based life would go away. And then there's a catch-all called novel entities, which is chemicals created by humans that the planet doesn't know how to deal with. So, the Stockholm Resilience Center asked, are there any boundaries that if we cross even one, our global experiment in economics and all of this goes away, well, there's a natural follow-up question, right? How are we doing? How many have we crossed? So they went and hosted the conferences and did the research and gathered the data and ran the computer simulations and all the things they needed to do, and they published a paper in 2015. And in 2015, they found we'd already crossed 4 of them. We had crossed the planetary boundaries for climate change, the rate of extinction, land system change, and reactive nitrogen and phosphorus. But then the research continued. They got better and better at gathering data and doing the analysis. So in 2021, they added freshwater use and ocean acidification. That doesn't mean we crossed these boundaries between 2015 and 2021, but just that the quality of the science became good enough to say, we are now confident with all of our data that we've crossed them. And then in 2022, they added novel entities because of microplastics. Because microplastics are synthetic polymers that can now be found in every drop of breast milk in every woman on Earth, and in every water supply in every aquifer on Earth. They even find it in clouds above the mountains. And so, as of right now, we have crossed 7 of 9 planetary boundaries. Now, when you look at something like this, do you just start to think, so the solution to this is to change your light bulbs? Or maybe the solution to this is more consumer products that are labeled green. Or maybe the solution is to replace the internal combustion engine in your single occupancy vehicle with an electric battery in your single occupancy vehicle. But to make the battery, you have to mine the seafloor or scrape off the tops of mountains to get the lithium. And we call these environmental solutions, which tells us that our environmental discourse is very, very far from reality. What this image tells us is that nothing less than the wholesale reimagining of humanity's presence on Earth will do. We have to completely reimagine the human presence on Earth. So I want to walk through this a little bit. How do these planetary boundaries work, and what does it tell us about how much we know about the Earth? So this is a graphic that summarizes the tipping points of the Earth system. Now I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want you to know there are quite a few. And let's just look at a couple. The Greenland ice sheet. The Greenland ice sheet melts due to global warming, then it will cause sea level rise. But also, the melting of the Greenland ice sheet can cause the shutdown of the deep water formation in the North Atlantic, which would have an immediate catastrophic effect on the weather systems of the Earth. Or the permafrost in Siberia, where there's frozen tundra 4 meters thick. Because it's frozen, it doesn't decompose. But as it starts to warm, it decomposes. What is decomposition? It's microbes eating away at the vegetative materials, which releases massive amounts of methane. And now there are these huge craters exploding out of the ground in Siberia as the permafrost is melting and the methane is released. Or the dieback of the coral reefs of the ocean due to ocean acidification or bleaching events. Or the West Antarctic ice sheet, which if it falls into the ocean, would immediately cause sea level to rise by about 4 meters. Or the dieback of the Amazon rainforest due to deforestation. Or the dieback of the boreal forest, the world's largest forest, a band of forest around the Arctic Circle. I don't know if anyone noticed the pattern of wildfires in Canada this year. Do you think maybe the boreal forest is starting to die back? And so there are a lot of tipping points. And so what the planetary boundaries is measuring is what do we have to do to keep from having these tipping points crossed. These tipping points that are already starting to be crossed right now. And these tipping points are not separate from each other. They can actually have cascades. As one of them happens, it makes another one more likely or makes it happen more quickly. So this is a measure, in a sense, or a picture of the global systemic risk of the Earth, of how the systems of the Earth are connected to each other. And as they're connected to each other, if you break down the stability in one, it causes the stability to break down in others. And that creates systemic risk. Let's look at an example of this. This is a simple feedback loop for the Arctic Ocean. Works like this. You heat the atmosphere, so you have global warming. The warming is amplified in the Arctic, 5 to 10 times more warming in high latitudes than the equator, which causes a reduction in Arctic sea ice. But sea ice reflects 90% of sunlight back into space, whereas the dark blue ocean absorbs about 90%. So you go from 90% reflected to 90% absorbed, which causes the ocean to absorb more heat, which causes the atmosphere to be hotter, and this is a positive feedback loop. So the question becomes, what happens when there's no more ice in the Arctic Ocean? What's called the blue ocean event, which is on schedule to happen by 2030, in the next few years. If you watch year by year, the Arctic ice, as it's fluctuating year to year, we've gotten really close in the last few years to getting to zero ice in the Arctic Ocean during the Northern Hemisphere summer. So what happens when that ice is gone? Well, let's look. This, right here, is a jet stream. The jet stream is where our storm tracks are that tell us where is the precipitation. This is the characteristic pattern of our region. As you can see here, it's shaped like the capital letter omega. That omega pattern is what makes it rain in the Pacific Northwest in the winter. Once that pattern is set up, you get multiple months of rain here. So what do you think is going to happen when there's no longer ice in the Arctic Ocean and you completely change the heating of the Arctic? It causes the jet stream to move, and it becomes more chaotic and more turbulent. And then you have less stable weather. And then you lose this characteristic pattern of winter rainfall in the Northwest. So we can start to see the changes to the Arctic can change the weather that defines Cascadia. Because Cascadia is defined by the kind of ecosystem and the kind of climate that exists here, the kind of weather patterns that you get. And so this is starting to reveal these systemic patterns. So the lesson from all of this is that the Earth is a whole system with all these cascading consequences. And the cascading consequences are relationships that unfold across space and time. The breakdown unfolds across space and time. And the key word I want to emphasize is across, which is different places are connected to each other. So it's across places and across time. There's no single place-based solution. So now I want to share with you something that I've learned as I've traveled around visiting regenerative projects around the world. What I've learned is there are a lot of regenerative projects. There are a lot of permaculture sites, reforestation efforts, ecosystem restoration, riparian recovery of rivers, fish being brought back, all kinds of projects, but they're all bounded by the boundaries of a plot of land. Right? Like I got this great 20-acre regenerative farm. But the problem is that plot of land is embedded in a larger set of ecological connections. For example, you might have a beautiful regenerative farm within a watershed, and someone upstream from you dumps chemicals, and then they run across your land. There are ecological connections beyond the boundary of the land, right? But those ecological connections organize themselves into holistic landscapes. Things like the watershed itself, or a coastal estuary, or a local climate pattern for precipitation, right? There are larger systems that define holistic landscapes through these ecological connections. But the landscapes are embedded within planetary scale processes, like some of the ones we were just alluding to. Now, when I look at these 4 different levels, and I ask myself, where is the pathway to planetary sustainability? I can just check them off. It's not going to occur at any of those 4 levels. But if I squint my eyes and change my thinking ever so slightly, I start to see that the solution, or the pathway, is to understand the relationship between the levels, to actually work across levels. So, if I have a regenerative farm that's ecologically connected through a watershed, then I can start to organize with other regenerative projects within the watershed around those naturally occurring ecological connections to regenerate the watershed. Right, I can start to work across levels. And so this leads to a really profound, seemingly or deceptively simple observation, which is that everything that happens anywhere on Earth happens somewhere. Which means every place on Earth becomes a locus or a center for transformational change. Every place is connected to this web of relationships across the Earth. So when you look at something like, here's the North American continent, maybe to start to get some context, where are we? We're right there, right? We're right there, we're in that part. So let's look at that for a second. Where are we? We're right here on Vashon Island. I don't know if that's exactly where that dot is. That's just the marker for Vashon Island in Google Earth. You see, we're on this island. Seems kind of complicated, this landscape around us. There's a lot going on. We zoom out a little bit. Holy cow, that's complicated. There's like this whole chain of islands, like the tidal movements of water. There are like all these mountains. It's really complex. And so we need to start to understand, what is this place that is here? We're here. What is this place? And how could this place organize us across levels? So this is what's really beautiful, is if you take any place, the land will tell you how to organize. In that place, or in this place, there is a unique geologic history of this place that's unlike any other place on Earth. There's also an ecological history of this place that is unique, unlike any other place on Earth. And if humans have lived here, there's a unique cultural history of this place. So when you start to look at your place and ask, how is this place organized? By gathering the geologic history and gathering the ecological and cultural history, you begin to construct the story of your place. What is the story of this place? And what happens if someone comes to this place? Like Terry said, I used to live in Chicago and I moved. What happens when you come to this place? Is the story already written down and finished? No. The story is alive. It's unfolding right now. You join the story when you come to a place. You can even think of it as a verb. We are storying this place. And everyone in this room is part of the unfolding story of this place. And so as you reconstruct the story of your place, you begin to gain whole system understandings of your place. What kind of place is this? How does life work in this place? What kind of life, what kind of ecosystems are in this place? If humans live here, how do humans organize themselves to be sustainable in this place? And as you start to build those whole system understandings of your place, you begin to imagine regenerative futures. You begin to imagine, how do we heal that river that's been damaged? How do we restore those mountain slopes that have been deforested? How do we bring the salmon back to the places where they no longer are? How do we bring the beavers back to the places that we need them to protect us against wildfires? You start to imagine regenerative futures because they come from the history of the place. The history of the place tells you what the place is capable of. And I guarantee you the place is capable of more than you could imagine before you learn the story of your place. Place, it has this transformational capacity because place is so powerful. So let's look at a couple examples of this. This is a picture that I took from Google Earth, and that's Eugene, Oregon. So north is that way. If you look at an image like this, you say, where is it most degraded? Now my daughter's 6 years old and she loves to draw, so she'd probably come up here and draw on it and she'd say, oh, those places. Right, it's pretty obvious. If I take this off, you can see that all of the major destruction of habitat is where there's farming and agriculture, and it's in the watersheds. It's in the valleys. And so you can start to organize around the regeneration of those valleys. And you can just see it. Like this section right here is maybe 10 miles long, maybe 3 or 4 miles across. That's a human scale. Maybe there are 100 farms or 100 pieces of land in that valley, and you can start to imagine organizing the regeneration of that valley. It's at a scale that makes sense. You could walk from one end to the other in a day. Or maybe it's only 10 miles. Certainly in a car, you could drive around it. You could thoroughly study it in a month. Now that doesn't mean you know everything in a month. Those of you who work with land know that even a little bitty place you can learn from for decades. But you could begin to imagine a collective vision of regeneration at that scale. And you can start to see how the land tells us how to organize ourselves. The land says, I'm already organized by the movements of water pulled by gravity. So why don't you use that to organize yourselves? What's interesting is, if we go out to something like the Willamette Valley, now I've changed direction and this way is north. See, Portland's over here and Eugene's over there. This is the Willamette Valley in Oregon. That's a terribly degraded landscape, right? It's terribly degraded. It used to all be forest and wetlands. When you look at that and you say, well, how would we ever regenerate something that large? But it's the same as before. Look at the most degraded places. It's the watersheds. It's the valleys. And now you can imagine parallel projects. The three of them I showed you before are right there in Eugene. Now I didn't color all of them in, but you can start to see a translocal solution. Translocal means multiple locations at the same time, which is that each place organizes the regeneration of its watershed, and you start to see how you could regenerate the Willamette Valley. Now, if we zoom out even further to the Columbia River Basin, 258,000 square miles, the same size as the drainage of the Colorado River, it's frickin' huge, right? It goes all the way up there to the Columbia Ice Sheet, near Jasper, the Canadian Rockies, and down here's the Snake River that actually flows out of Yellowstone. This thing's huge. How would you ever regenerate all of that? But look, there's that Willamette Valley. And you start to see there's a fractal pattern, a nested pattern, that you can organize local projects around the features of landscapes and do multiple of them, just multiple different groups organizing them. And you could do them for all 174 watersheds that drain into the Columbia River. That would just be 174 watershed restoration projects. We start to see the patterning and the intelligence of place. Place tells us how to organize ourselves. So this is the watersheds of all of Cascadia. So this here is the Columbia Basin. This is the Fraser River. Here's the Willamette Valley. This is a powerful way to organize local landscapes by watersheds. The water already organizes them. We as humans can organize ourselves within them. So now imagine a mycelial web spreading across Cascadia, place by place, organizing around the restoration of watersheds. So here we are doing a Regenerate Cascadia tour. We're visiting 14 places in 30 days. And so you can start to say, oh, maybe something like this. No, I drew it up Vancouver Island. I pretended we went up to Fraser. But you get the idea, right? Like, we can have multiple places that each say, we're going to regenerate this much larger bioregion because I'm responsible for my place, you're responsible for your place, and we're going to help each other. And as we do this, other people might get word, and they start doing it in other parts of the bioregion. And then we spread and cover the entire bioregion in this way. Now, to do this work, we need to have a shared understanding of how do we structure our relationships to place? How do we structure our collaborations with each other to be able to do this? And I just want to name some of the major structures. There are actually other ones. But if we're going to organize bioregions around the world and regenerate them in each place, then we need to have some basic structures that everyone can pick up and start to use. And so once again, it's organized by the land. The land tells us how to organize ourselves. First thing that we need to do is create bioregional learning centers. A bioregional learning center is how you learn the story of your place and how everyone in your place learns how to live in this place. So a bioregional learning is like, what are the native plants? Which plants can be used to make textiles? Are there local ways of making medicine? What kinds of animals live here? Which ones can we hunt? How would we manage that to be sure we have healthy populations? This is all kinds of things are like learning about place. Welcome, come in, come in.
Thank you.
How's it going? Good to see you. And so one way that we can structure the regeneration of bioregions is with bioregional learning centers. We'll talk a little bit more about what those are. Another thing is we have to create territorial governance. Welcome. Territorial governance means we have to have ways of setting priorities, making decisions, allocating resources, having criteria for our success. Well, we have to create governance around how we manage the restoration of our landscapes. One way we can start to do this is by creating tapestries of local projects. There are a lot of regenerative projects already happening right here on Vashon Island. How much do they know about each other? How much do they work together? Are they a tapestry? And if they're not, how do you go about making them one? And that there are lots of learning processes, but how do we create ecosystems of learning, where the learning comes together, organized around the landscape scale? And all of this is based on a foundation of the design of pro-social contexts. What this means is we need to be able to create shared identities, shared purposes. For example, do we want salmon in this river? That could be a shared purpose, and then different actors can come together around the shared purpose. Then we have to have equitable contributions and benefits. We need to have fair and inclusive decision making, right? We need to have fast and fair conflict resolution. If there are multiple groups, we have to have collaborative relations between the different groups. So the design of pro-social context means we have to actively create the conditions for cooperation, because they're not just going to happen on their own. You have to design them into being. Luckily, there's a lot that's known about how to do that. But it's often sort of an afterthought, like, the problem is the salmon. There are no salmon in this river. No, the problem is the humans cooperated to get the salmon out of the river. And the humans who want the salmon in the river are not cooperating well enough to get them back. And so it turns out that the design of pro-social context is core to this work. It's really core. And there's a whole conversation around trauma healing and intergenerational amnesia and other things, but that just gets into the nuance of the design of pro-social context. So these are some of the structures, and we're going to go through them. But before we go through them, I want to be sure we have a shared, really simple understanding of bioregions. Like, why bioregions? What is a bioregion? I just want to remind us that the word bioregion is just short for biological region. Sometimes it's biocultural region, but that's just biological cultural region. And culture, by the way, is called animal behavior. So it's a subset of biology. So it's biological. So biological region, what do I mean by this? What I mean is every living organism has a geographic range that is the context for the whole life system of that organism. The example I like to use is starfish, because starfish have a really easy geography, a really easy biological region to understand. What is the place that starfish exist? It's the intertidal zone, right? You go out to the coastline, and you have the high tide and the low tide, and in between them are tide pools, and in that space, or maybe they're tide pools, but whatever it is, they have the place for their homes, they have all the food they need, they have protection against predators, they can mate and reproduce, and everything they need as a population is in the bioregion of the intertidal zone. You can say the same thing about any other living organism. There's a biological region for oak trees. There's a biological region for elk, right? But when you add humans, it gets really interesting, because the geography for a sustainable human culture depends on worldview, it depends on technology, it depends on the model of social organization, the kind of economic or political system, right? And so the boundaries of human bioregions are culturally contested, which means they have this aspect that's the cultural identity of place. It's actually one of the reasons the bioregionalism movement was really powerful and then weakened, was there were a lot of arguments about the boundaries of bioregions. Those of you who were around back in the early days know what I'm talking about. Starfish don't really have to worry about that so much. But the powerful thing about this is that a bioregion is the entire context for the life system of the population. It's the entire geographic area, which means each bioregion, by definition, is the whole system model of its own health and well-being. What is the whole system for health and well-being of starfish? It's a healthy intertidal zone, which means that the bioregion becomes the model for regeneration. It's sort of by definition. The only scale at which you can have healthy regeneration is the scale of the whole life context of the organism, which means the only way human culture ever becomes sustainable is when it's defined as and organized as a bioregion, which means it's organized for the whole life context for the human population. So now we have to think of it in this way. We need to reorganize the human presence on Earth as bioregions. Then we need to create a planetary network of bioregions and learning exchanges between them because we don't have much time, right? So you can have sister bioregions that have similar types of ecosystems or similar types of culture, right? You can have all kinds of bioregions. And the idea is that we need to organize ourselves into bioregions, and luckily Cascadia has been doing that for about 50 years. So it's got a pretty strong leg up. Because what needs to happen is this. We need to recreate the conditions for living locally in terms of material flows. Integrated life systems means humans and the rest of life, right? And then we need thriving families and thriving communities. This is back to that joke I made about how we're not just going to change our light bulbs to get back within the planetary boundaries. I really like this map because this is a map of ecozones, which is basically the types of soils, the types of climate, and the types of ecosystems that exist in different places. Now, what the colors represent isn't important for us here. What matters is that there's more than one color. There are many different kinds of ecozones, which means we should expect many different kinds of human economies and human cultures, each one appropriate to its own place. There's not a planetary solution to human culture. There is a land system solution for human culture, the co-evolution of humans and landscape. And it's different in each place. So, a little bit of a history, like a little tour through history. In 1972, the first ever computer simulation of the global economy was conducted. It was a famous study because it created a huge controversy. The study was called Limits to Growth. It was published in 1972. They invented a scenario called business as usual. That's where that phrase, business as usual, comes from. And the business as usual scenario was not meant to be a forecast. It was just a scenario. But we've actually tracked it with almost perfect accuracy between then and now. And in that scenario, they showed the human population slowing down starting in 2030, reaching its peak by 2040, and very quickly collapsing after that. Which means the death rate starts to shoot up around 2030 till it catches up with the birth rate at about 2040. And the human system collapses, the human population collapses. This is why Limits to Growth was so controversial. And so a bunch of really great thinkers got together after the study was conducted, and they met at Lake Balaton in Hungary, so they called themselves the Balaton Group. And for about 10 years, they met in different places around the world, places like MIT and Stanford and big universities in Europe and in Asia and all over the world. And for 10 years, they asked, what's the best way to get to planetary sustainability? How do we live within planetary limits? In 1983, the lead author of the Limits to Growth study, Donella Meadows, she wrote an essay called A Brief History of the Balaton Group. It wasn't widely read, but it started to be recirculated in the last couple of years. And this is a quote from that essay, where Vernon Rutten, who was a member of the Balaton Group, he was an economist of agriculture, he said this. He said, each agroeconomic region is so unique that the concept of transfer of technology is irrelevant. What's relevant is the transfer of the capacity to develop technology and institutions that are consistent with the cultural endowment and resource endowment of each region. Every place has to build institutions to govern its own resources appropriate to that place. That's what he said in 1983. And then Dana Meadows, in the same essay, said this: out of those 10 years of meetings came a vision of a number of centers where information and models about resources and the environment are housed. There would need to be many of these centers all over the world, each one responsible for a distinct bioregion. So in 1983, 40 years ago, the best way that anyone knew to get to planetary sustainability was to create local living economies, organized as bioregions, and to create a bioregional learning center in each of those places to learn how to become sustainable. So has there been a better way to get to planetary sustainability between 1983 and now? No. No, there has not. I was 6 years old in 1983, and the only way that anyone could find to get to planetary sustainability was known. What happened after 1983 was the environmental discourse stopped talking about human population, stopped talking about consumption, became technocratic and reductionistic, became about green consumer products, and reduced the entire problem to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While this has been the way forward, and we knew, our elders knew. Some of you were with these people at the time they were saying this. We knew, which is to say, we need to organize ourselves as bioregions and regenerate them and bring back their living capacities. And we need to do it through the rest of the collapse process that is already underway. And so this brings us to a living example that is not in your bioregion, so you can start to see how it works. This is a topographic map of Colombia. These are the northern Andes, where the Andes make a sharp turn to the left and go toward Panama. I live right in the middle of this colored region right here, where there's a well-defined climate system because of a tall mountain range here, tall mountain range here, and tall mountain range there, and the air can only get in through here with moisture, creates a really strong circulation and a well-defined regional climate system at the scale of about 500,000 hectares, or 1 million acres of land. Within that region is a unique type of ecosystem like no other on Earth, called the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. That tropical dry forest is 80% endemic species, so 8 out of 10 species exist nowhere else on Earth, and it's more than 95% deforested and rapidly becoming a desert. So I moved to this region in 2019, so just 4 years ago, and I live in this little town called Barichara. Barichara is a word from the Guane tongue. The Guane are the indigenous people of the region, and Barichara means the place of rest. The place to go to find deep connection and peace in yourself. It's a place of healing. The tourism slogan for Barichara is the most beautiful town in Colombia, which is probably true because it's really beautiful. And so Barichara is there. It's got a population of about 6,000 people, and this in the foreground is a community reforestation project called Bioparque Moncora. And that is why I actually went to Barichara, is that I heard there was a community reforestation project working with families and children, and I might be able to raise my daughter while bringing forests and dead rivers back to life. And so we went there to see if we could get involved in Bioparque Moncora, which we did. And when we got there, because I'm trained in Earth system science and I studied the formation of clouds, I could stand in this place and look up at the sky and see the way that the air moved and the way the clouds formed to see how to regenerate it. And so one of the things I started to do, like a good permaculture designer does, is you show up in a place and you don't intervene. You just observe the patterns. And as you observe the patterns, you start to see what you can work with. So what I started to observe was that there were some really good regenerative projects. Really good. With good track records of success, but they were fragmented and isolated, and they didn't know about each other. So what I started to do was to meet with people from the different projects to see how I could organize them with each other. Started creating a design school for healing the entire landscape. We did this with 4 key patterns that helped us organize the landscape as a whole. One of those patterns was the restoration of entire watersheds. Because in Barichara, all of the rivers are dead. They're dead. Either there's no water in them at all, and when it rains, the water just runs gushing with massive erosion into the valley below, or they're so contaminated that nothing can live in them. This is something that's actually typical of Latin America, and typical of many places in Africa, typical of many places in Southeast Asia. The rivers are dead. And so we have to work on restoring the rivers. So we started setting up community water councils, we started organizing reforestation and watershed restoration and soil building within the watersheds, which is a pattern across the territory. Second thing we did as a pattern of integration was we created a learning center in syntropic agroforestry. Syntropic agroforestry is the fastest way to grow climax ecosystems, the most complex biodiverse ecosystems. But it's very labor intensive, it's very knowledge intensive, and it has to be taught. So we invited teachers of syntropic agroforestry, we set up demonstration sites where we had workshops to establish them. Now we have 2 community demonstration sites. The people that go through the workshops, many of them have their own land and are doing reforestation on their land. So then we create learning exchanges by doing technical site visits where everyone goes to each person's land and they all learn together as a pattern across the territory. But this is a syntropic agroforestry system, which means it's not just reforestation. You can grow food, you can grow medicinal plants, you can grow textiles and natural fibers, and you can grow construction materials. Everything you need for the basis of a local economy is in the forest. Which leads to the transformation of local food systems. We're really lucky in Barichara. There are about 6,000 people in the town, about 5,000 people spread throughout the countryside around us, so it's a pretty small population. And 70% of our food in the town is grown within 10 kilometers of the town, which is amazing. Because usually it's like 3% or less in most places. Cities are screwed when it comes to food sheds. It's terrible. So we're 70%, we're pretty close. Which means as we set up agroforestry systems and as we work on changing over the more industrial kinds of agriculture to agroforestry and then regenerative agroforestry, we're moving toward a 100% sustainable food system. Then we have the design of alternative economic models, which is that we created a project, we're really a local woman named Margarita, with a network of 50 campesino families called Mujer y Vida, just woman in life, and started working on food security in their homes. And so we started helping them to mobilize resources from the outside to help them create experiments so that they could create solidarity-based economic exchanges, cooperative ownership models, a community store, a community currency, and they're continually experimenting in alternative economic models. And you can already see, just with these 4 patterns, a holistic and intelligent way of restoring a bioregion or a landscape. And so I want to talk a little bit about how this is done in practice, because at the core of everything that we do is education. Everything regenerative involves education. And we're trying to do education in really different ways in Barichara. For example, this guy here with the goatee, his name's Felipe, and he decided to organize a thing called Caminatas del Agua, water walks, because all the rivers are dead. So he took children between the age of 4 and 10 years old, got permission from landowners, and walked the dead stream beds. And as they walked through people's land, the children would interview the adults. And the children would ask, what happened to the water? Why aren't there fish here? Why is there no water in this stream? And this would break open the hearts of the adults and start to plant the seeds of conscience. Because Barichara, which is one of those islands of peace and prosperity in Colombia today, for about 40 years was the most violent place in Colombia during the period called La Violencia. It was the most violent place. They literally shot each other in the streets for like 40 years. And unlike most places where the peace is constructed by women, in Barichara the peace was constructed by the men. And it was because the grandsons in the third generation of violence saw their children reenacting the clan-based violence that they were doing, and they decided that it had to end. And they put a stop to it. And so now there's this really beautiful peace, but people are quiet about it. The adults don't talk about it. But the children can ask questions. And the adults will say, when we started fighting with our neighbors, the water went away. If we want the water to come back, we have to make peace with our neighbors. And this is led by the children. So when the children started working to restore the watersheds of the Barichara River, experts started to come and help them. And like this man here, this is an elder of the Muisca culture, which is the people based around Bogota. The wisdom holders from indigenous cultures come to guide and advise and inspire the children. And the children inspire the adults. And the children are leading the way. And so when the kids started to create their policy proposals for how to restore the river, you get some really interesting ideas. This little girl, her name is Quetzal. She's 7 years old now, but when this picture was taken, she was 6. And she's got this list of ideas that she's presenting about how to restore the Barichara River. My favorite one of them is when she said, well, we should take straw and bind it up, and then we should put mushrooms in it and put it into the river, and it'll catch the contaminants. Because she learned that watching YouTube. The kids have some really good ideas. And so the most important thing in this process is that the adults need to take the kids seriously. These kids are serious. But when the adults don't say, well, that's a stupid idea, but instead the adults say, well, that's really interesting, let's go watch some more of those videos and maybe let's try that out, then the kids are becoming the leaders in our community and they're transforming the culture. Imagine how different education can be when it's led by the children. Now this other picture captures another really important principle for how we do education in our community, because that's Gabriella and her granddaughter Soraya sitting in her lap. One of the things we do as often as we can in Barichara is when the adults have an important conversation, we make sure the children are playing in the center of the circle. Because we want those children to grow up remembering what the adults were talking about when they were kids. And we want the adults to hold themselves accountable to the children in front of them when they make decisions. This changes everything. By placing the children in the middle of the process, it changes everything. Like I said, everything about regeneration involves education, but sometimes the kids are the teachers. And so when we look at the projects in Barichara, we notice interesting things, like here's that Bioparque Moncora. You can't see her, but that's Camila. She's 72 years old, and she's one of the creators of the reforestation work there. She's one of our great heroes in the community. And Bioparque Moncora is right here. But there's another project right there. There's a little hiking trail between them. You can walk to it in 5 minutes. It's called Fundación Monte Chico. Monte Chico is a project to protect cultural knowledge about native plants by offering workshops to middle schoolers in bioconstruction, natural dyes, and textiles, with an indigenous element together with just skill-based and craft-based learning. What's interesting is these two projects should very readily collaborate, but when I arrived as the gringo from the outside, they didn't even know about each other. Because in Colombia, the way people survived during the extended period of violence was to keep their heads down and not talk. Because if you stuck your head up, you would piss off one of the 3 militant death squads that would kill people to get everyone to shut up. And so the Colombian culture learned to be silent. So it took an outsider to come in and build trust with each of them and bring them together. Which means there's a cultural regeneration process of restoring trust that involves an outsider. But you can just see it on the land. It's like they're so close and they're so aligned, but they weren't working together. Now what's interesting about what I was talking about earlier, organizing around land, is if you take regenerative projects like these, and there's just different projects in Barichara. I'll just name a couple. This is Cane Colibri. It's a community theater where they create theatrical plays informed by indigenous mythology to teach nature connection and ethical training to children. Then there's projects like Korosoma, which is about bringing circles of women together in conversation to do cultural healing around patterns of violence. And then there's Casa Común, where they're prototyping economic models based on solidarity. Or there's Agua Santa, which is a regenerative agriculture project that's doing watershed restoration and agroforestry. When you look at projects like these, thematically, you don't really know how to organize them or how they relate to each other or whether they should work together. It's just not clear. But when you look at them in the landscape, it's like, oh, that community theater's over here. And over here's a regenerative agriculture project, and they're connected by the drainage of a watershed. Let's create an education program between the community theater and the regenerative farms as the water moves from one to the other. And you start to see a way of organizing the local projects that just makes sense. It tells you how to prioritize and organize how to weave the local projects. And so, this is what we've been doing in Barichara. You know, I said that you need these structures of regeneration for bioregions, and one of them is bioregional learning centers. And so you can already see from the example of Barichara that there are things that bioregional learning is about. For example, the coordination of learning processes. That you may not even need a new learning program. It might be that there are already 5 or 6 of them that exist, but they don't work well together. So just creating coordination between them is work. So one thing that a bioregional learning center does is it creates coordination of learning processes within the bioregion. This leads to mapping and knowledge sharing. That you're mapping what's there. And as you're mapping what's there, you start to see ways of coordinating the learning. And these things feed each other back and forth. Then you start to see that a bioregional learning center is a gateway into the community. Because if you come in from the outside and you're like, I want to help, and I'm really interested in trauma healing, oh, you should work with this group over here. Oh, I really love trees and reforestation. Oh, you should work with that group over there. To have a gateway for entering into the community process, that's possible if there's coordination among the learning processes. And by the way, this is true for people within the community too. I'm in the community and I want to get involved in restoring this watershed. Well, come to the Bioregional Learning Center and they'll help you navigate and wayfind to the place that's most appropriate for you. This is something a Bioregional Learning Center can do. It's also the place of advanced modeling and simulation. Think of our best universities and research laboratories where they'll do things like study the mixing patterns of the Salish Sea as it relates to fisheries. Right? You have computer simulations, you have sensor networks, you have scientific visualization, you have collaboration between UW and OSU and I don't know what, right? You have these advanced research labs. Well, a bioregional learning center will make those simulation studies useful because they'll bring them into community design processes. They'll bring them into integrated landscape planning, right? And so there's still a place for advanced science and advanced research as part of this process. And at the same time, there's this really strong need for reconnecting and integrating indigenous knowledge and the decolonization of education and the decolonization of our minds. So another thing that a bioregional learning center can do is to help support the coherence and the sovereignty of indigenous knowledge held by indigenous peoples in collaboration with research and science and modeling and community education and ecosystem restoration and whatever else is needed. And then a bioregional learning center becomes a place, like a platform, for that partnership to occur. And notice that bioregional learning centers are both centralized and decentralized. They have some parts that create coordination together so that the separate activities can have coherence with each other while remaining autonomous. So bioregional learning centers are both of these things. When we look at territorial governance, we start to see some similar patterns. One thing that territorial governance does is it can map and weave local projects. Now, why does the weaving occur? Why is this governance? Because the only way to map local projects is to bring leaders from those projects together and have them share information with each other. And as they share information with each other, they start to identify shared needs and priorities. They begin a process of discernment and decision-making just by coming together to map their projects. They start to say, wow, wait, you guys have what? Oh, we could really use that over here. And they start to share resources. They start to make decisions. They're engaging in governance. Another thing is that to do this work, we have to form landscape partnerships, which means we have to have different stakeholders in the community come together. Just imagine like a watershed. You have some people that care about the fish, other people that are farmers that care about the soils and food production, other people that are focused on children and education. There are different stakeholders. So you form landscape partnerships. These partnerships collaborate together to work at the scale of the landscape. And as they do this, you also discover something interesting, is that you automatically begin to form community funding structures. Now, funding here really means the mobilization of anything of value, not only money. But you might have in your landscape partnership, oh, well, we're really good at getting volunteers because we have a school program with high schoolers, and they're required to do X number of community service hours per month. You need volunteers? We got them. And you can start to mobilize resources through these partnerships. So community funding structures naturally start to arise as a kind of governance. But what it does that's different is you mobilize the resources in service to the whole landscape, instead of competition for scarce resources for individual projects, because they're organizing themselves at the landscape scale. It's that upward spiral of virtuous circles. And this is how you cultivate local sovereignty. Local sovereignty isn't just earned by living in a place. It's not like, it's my privilege to have sovereignty because I'm here, as I piss all over the ground and throw my garbage. No, you earn sovereignty by organizing around the priorities and caring for and acting in service to the well-being of your place. So by mapping projects, identifying needs, partnering together, mobilizing resources, you become sovereign. You become sovereign. And this is because you're strengthening collaboration internally as you do this. You're actually building local governance, local funding, local planning, local coordination among multi-stakeholder groups within your landscape. This is how territorial governance is created. Now I want to talk about this in a way that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. That's really important, which is how would you fund the regeneration of a bioregion? How would you do that? Well, this is a model created by the Common Land Foundation. Common Land Foundation is based in Amsterdam. They were founded in 2012. Their founder is a man named Willem Verweerde, who at one time was the director of IUCN, which is the Global Organization for Biodiversity. He's trained as a tropical ecologist, and he noticed in all of his years of doing conservation work that everything was funded as projects, and once the funding ran out, you could just cue the chainsaws. Like if someone else with money would come in and buy the land and do whatever the hell they wanted. And he just watched over and over again that there was not a way to finance the process of continual and permanent regeneration. And he tried to solve this. And it helps he's from Amsterdam because there's a lot of money in that part of the world. So he happened to have a friend who was a billionaire that owned this big auto company, and he said, I gotta convince this guy to give money to like regenerate landscapes. And then he started to realize, this is a nice guy, and he's smart, and he's good in business, but ecologically speaking, he's kind of an idiot. Like, you talk ecology, it's like, doesn't get it. So Willem started looking for language that investors understand. Where like, they care about the environment, but they don't know how to invest in the environment, because they don't know ecology. So they started asking himself, has anyone ever funded a large-scale project worth hundreds of millions of dollars that lasts 20 years or longer? And the answer is yes, all the time. They're called infrastructure projects. Like think about the ferry system or a regional transit system, the light rail system in Seattle. It's like a $1 billion project, right? So more, right? Even more. And it lasts for 30 years or longer. Just rolling it out, just building it is like a 25-year project. So what Willem Verweerde realized was there was a language you could use to talk about regenerating landscapes, which is to treat them as though they're large-scale infrastructure projects. And then he created this model. This is a model that takes at least 20 years and is on a scale of 100,000 hectares or larger. And what he found was, with any infrastructure project, you need a management team that's going to manage all of the processes of the project. So think of an infrastructure project. Someone's got to do hiring, someone's got to handle legal, someone's got to be able to do all the sourcing of materials, right? There's these processes that have to be maintained throughout the whole process. And so we found to regenerate a watershed, you need a core team. You need a core team that just manages those processes the whole time. And he found that in practice, to regenerate a watershed or another large-scale landscape system, you need about $2 million a year for your landscape team that are holding these processes. So just do the math. $2 million a year, 20 years, $40 million. But what is the core team managing? They're managing the creation of the infrastructure for a different kind of economic system. And so, you need funding for regenerative projects, and you need to fund the integration and the coordination of those projects so that they become something that economists call public goods infrastructure. Public goods are things that you invest in together that everyone benefits from and that you need for your society to function. For example, to have a knowledge-based economy, you need an educated population, so education is a public good. And you should use taxpayer money, or however you do it, to be sure everyone gets an education, and that's an investment in the public good. The public goods infrastructure here is the supply chains and the coordination of your regenerative projects. Like, how would you restore the watershed that requires planting 500,000 trees? And those 500,000 trees are 50 different species, and at the same time you have to do composting and biochar and soil building. This is infrastructure, right? This is like tree nurseries and composting systems and logistics. It's all kinds of things. And so you need to fund regenerative projects so that they can integrate, coordinated by the core team that is convening and mapping and creating plans and helping to co-create with those projects the integration of those projects. And what they found was it usually costs about twice as much, $4 or $5 million per year for a landscape. So again, you do the math. 20 years, $5 million, $100 million. What they found in practice is this: regenerative businesses don't become viable until after about 8 to 10 years. Because you have to start building up these supply chains and this infrastructure. So regenerative businesses just don't work, and they're not profitable. But after a while, there's enough integration, enough collective intelligence, enough optimization and service to what the economy is for, regenerative businesses start to work. But it takes 8 to 10 years, which means all of this is philanthropic or public goods investment with no financial return. So if you're an investor who wants like an impact fund with financial return, you're not getting it here. But after 8 to 10 years, you start to get regenerative businesses, which means they generate profit, which means there's a tax base for that revenue, which means governments only start to understand this model after year 8. Because they don't really have anything they know how to work with. But once there's a tax base and they have enough experience seeing all these projects work, they can actually start to create green bonding structures and other things. It's usually local governments that do this. And they start to invest in their economy. And then the regenerative economy takes off. And this is what they found in practice. They're now working in about 25 landscapes around the world. And this is an investment vehicle. For about $150 million, you can fund for 20 years the creation of a regenerative economy. Now, do you think that regenerative economy is a good investment for $150 million? Hell yes. this is a viable investment instrument, and people have been funding at this scale since 2012. And so I just wanted to show you this to see that there are actually very powerful ways to think about organizing and mobilizing resources at the scales that are needed. So the idea is this: you need to create bioregional investment platforms, which is if you're weaving that tapestry of local projects around some kind of territorial scale landscape like a watershed, that those projects become like a portfolio, which means you can reduce the risk of investing in any one of them by investing in all of them together, but at a larger scale. And this is how you can create a robust circulation of values and benefits for the landscape as a whole. And so in Barichara, we're doing with the Territorial Foundation. I'm not going to talk about what that is at the moment, but the basic idea is as you weave tapestries of projects, you create funding and governance capacities that didn't exist before. And so the basic structure is this: your bioregional learning center is coordinating the learning processes, which is the basis of how you learn how to create this different kind of an economy. That there's territorial governance that naturally begins to form and is guided in its formation as you weave together the projects, create priorities and criteria, begin to mobilize the organizing capacities. And this is all done through a framework of integrated landscape management, that you actually integrate the functions of the landscape into the same process. And this creates value flows between those different structures. Or said in another way, you weave the people in projects. This grows their cooperative abilities locally, which deepens their capacities to organize themselves until you birth a regenerative economy, which is by definition bioregional. So this is how it works. This has been done, this can be done. We're doing it in Columbia. You can do it here. So if you start to look at something like the Salish Sea and go, wow, interesting, we could do that in every one of these watersheds, right? Every one of these watersheds could create bioregional learning centers and governance. And what's interesting about these watersheds is if you compare them to a map of the language families of indigenous peoples, see, a language family is sort of like the remnant of extended economic exchange, right? It's like you develop a shared language over time as you engage in trade. So these maps of language families, which roughly correspond with the watersheds, notice they're not exact. They're not exactly the same, but they're broadly similar. And that's because indigenous people organized themselves around watersheds and exchanged across neighboring watersheds and created coherent language in communicating with each other in intermarriages and other things that lasted in this region across the span of about 15,000 years, or possibly longer, but certainly going back that long. And so you can start to see that the indigenous cultures give us the first prototypes for these regenerative economies. They already did it for thousands of years. And so they've already organized themselves bioregionally, and they've already organized themselves around watersheds. And that also helps you see the rationale for this little experiment we're doing in our Regenerate Cascadia tour. Where in 30 days, we're visiting 14 places, having the same conversation. So we started up here in the Columbia River Gorge, then we went to Eugene, then we went to Portland, we were just in Olympia, we came across the ferry in Tacoma today, and we're on Vashon with you guys. Sunday morning, we go to Seattle. We're giving talks and workshops about regenerating Cascadia in all these places. After Seattle, we go to Whidbey Island. And then it actually changes sequence here, and this is a little bit of an outdated picture, because from Whidbey Island, we jump across to Port Townsend and Fort Worden. And then we go up to Victoria and and Vancouver Island. And then we go to Gabriola Island, which is between Vancouver Island and Vancouver. And then we go to Bellingham and Skagit Valley as we make our way back to Seattle. And in 30 days, we're going to weave together the mycelium of conversations about regenerating Cascadia. Because this kind of parallel organizing is necessary for this to work. It has to be done in parallel in multiple places at the same time. Each place responsible for their own place, but also coordinating when necessary with the other places. And you can start to see that this way of thinking goes a lot bigger. Because notice the entire North American continent is organized as watersheds. Penny and I, back in January and February, did a bioregional activation tour in the Great Lakes. We started in southern Ontario, in what's called the Greater Takaranto bioregion, around Toronto. And then we went down to the Finger Lakes and Genesee River in upstate New York. Then we went to the Cuyahoga River in northeastern Ohio, along the southern shore of Lake Erie. And we started collaboration along this part of the Great Lakes. And it's continued to spread. And we're preparing for a big summit in early February around regeneration of the Great Lakes. In May and June, we did a bioregional activation tour from the headwaters of the Colorado River and the western slopes of the Colorado Rockies. We went down through canyon lands and the convergence of the Green River and the Colorado. We went down to Mexicali, Mexico, to the Sea of Cortez, where the water no longer runs into the sea. We went along the Gila River in Arizona that drains into the Colorado River, and we connected with communities around the regeneration of the Colorado. And about a month ago, landscape leaders from all of those places gathered in Paonia, which is one of the headwaters of the Colorado Basin in Colorado. There's a huge focus on permaculture and biodynamic grazing and biodynamic farming. And they held a leadership summit around the regeneration of the Colorado River. And now here we are in Cascadia, and you start to see the pattern. Conversations are starting to emerge for the next big section of North America, the Mississippi. Because we have people in the Driftless region in Wisconsin and Minnesota. We have people in the Ogallala Aquifer. They're starting to talk about this. And now you see how to regenerate a continent. You regenerate a continent with multiple bioregions organizing themselves around their landscapes and collaborating across them. This is how to regenerate a continent. You could do this for every continent on Earth. You might give a pass to Antarctica, because we don't have that much time. But for all the other ones, you can see all of these continents are already organized. They show us how to organize ourselves. We organize according to the land. That's what we're doing in the Design School for Regenerating Earth, which launched officially in March, so it's only like half a year old. But we're already weaving all these conversations. The idea of the Design School is that people all over the world, they're gathering to regenerate the Earth at the bioregional scale. And they're organizing into a planetary network of learning exchanges between landscapes. So as we're visiting all these different regions, we're holding the space for learning exchanges. And I gotta tell you, the people in the Colorado Basin and the people in the Great Lakes are really excited as we're giving them updates about the Regenerate Cascadia Tour. And the Regenerate Cascadia Tour has already learned a lot from what we've been doing in the Colorado Basin and the Great Lakes. And you can see in the example of Barichara, there's also all the learning in the Northern Andes in South America. And so we're building a planetary network. And by the way, there are other places that are already organizing themselves, and we're finding each other. Because the idea is to create a planetary network within the next 2 years. And so that's what my book is about. You can get a copy of my book if you want. I can sign it for you. The Design School for Regenerating Earth is a place where we're gathering to do that part of the work. But we're here with a much more important local focus, which is the regeneration of Cascadia. The work that Brandon and Claire have been holding since about April, bringing us here. And I know Brandon would like to talk a little bit about the Cascadia work to give you more of a sense of how this is a lot more than just conversations and meetings that we're having. So I'd love to pass it over to Brandon.
And I think what's great is, I think Claire can now join us.
Claire,
Claire's going to get up here too. We're so
in case you're
lucky.
wondering, the microphone is because we're live streaming and recording. That's why you don't hear anything different. Is he speaking so that the computer picks it up? Passes to you.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar, so my name is Brandon Letsinger, and this is Claire Atwell. And we're very lucky because Claire is actually just joining us down from Victoria as of today. And so she's had a long drive, and so it's really fun to get to drag her up in front of the screen
and to actually meet you in person.
Yeah. We all have legs. So it's been Yeah, it's been really wonderful. So I think the big question for us here in this room today is, so what does this mean for here? And I think this is a really wonderful question because I think Joe and Penny and Benji and all of these people are doing a really amazing job of helping grow this planetary network of bioregions and bioregional movements. But for us, our question then is, how do we grow Cascadia and the Cascadia bioregion as a node, as part of this planetary network? And maybe more so even than that, how do we grow a core team for this watershed, for how about here on Vashon, as part of this bioregional node, as part of this planetary network? And I think from this conversation you can see this kind of scale of subsidiarity and these nestled landscape systems that can kind of move up. So what does this mean for Vashon? What does this mean for the Salish Sea? What does this mean for the Cascadia bioregion? And then as part of a broader planetary network. So how do we grow a core team? I think one of the best answers to this question is that this answer starts with everybody in this room. And it starts with conversations that we're having, and it probably starts with another meeting in person, maybe a potluck, maybe a conversation, maybe a strategy session, discussing what groups are present on Vashon. And what's really nice is that when we start to build these maps, when we start to talk about the regenerative projects happening and how we can connect them, we can also start talking about what resources and lessons can we learn together. Once we start to build this map of regenerative projects, we can also not only look at what voices are here and present in this room, but we can start looking around and also asking what voices are missing. What are the groups and organizations that we need to reach out to on Vashon to create this core team? And once we reach out to those voices, then we can actually start to have a dialogue. Is there anything that you might like to add?
Yeah, maybe just with you know, a lot of the time, as was being said, we don't know that we're as close and what to where we are geographically in the same area. And so using digital technology is really helpful, just to kind of start mapping so that it isn't up to one organization to start pulling it together. You can start actually accessing that information, that there isn't one group that is that holds all of that, so that so that there is also all of the information that we have, the maps and the learning, having that in a common, putting it into the commons basically, so that there is no bottleneck, there's no group that can co-opt the group as we start to come together, I think is really, really important. So I just, that was the piece that I just really wanted to emphasize.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think along with that, so just a little bit more about the Regenerate Cascadia program that we're growing and building, is this idea started in April or May of this year with about 4 of us, and I think the 4 of us are sitting in this room right now. And then by August, which was about, maybe 2 months ago now, we were up to 50 different organizers. And then about a few weeks ago, by the start of this tour, we were up to 150 different people that we're coordinating with in 14 different cities. And now as we travel, how big is this number growing? So you can start to really see this kind of large, wide kind of this large-scale impact that we can have when we start to gather together to have these conversations in so many different places at the same time. And I think in terms of what Claire was talking about, one of the most powerful things when you start to gather along watersheds and really start to think about watershed communities is, what are the projects that we don't know about? One of our big sparks for this was Claire and I were in this Edgewalker program, 140 different amazing people gathered throughout Salmon Nation, and there were projects that were doing exactly the same thing, using the same language, a mile away from each other, and they had never heard of each other. And this has been, like, as we've traveled, this has been one of the coolest things, as people gather and meet in person, is how many people in this room do you know or that you don't know, that you're not familiar with, when we were in the Columbia River, it was really inspirational. We stayed at Atlon Eco Village, one of 180 acre, off-grid permaculture, right next to a dam removal project. And and then another person was Christina Bowens, who's working on social roots and doing all of these cooperative structures. And they had wanted to work together for years, and they had never been in that same room. And here they were. And then we got to stop on our way out of town at Melcombe. They're making mead and through their own apiaries and doing off-grid permaculture. And they were 20 minutes away from each other, and they had never met together in person, even though they were using the same language. And they knew of each other, but they had never met.
And I have one thing. One of the things that has also come up is that a lot of people are doing the work and don't have time to attend tons of different meetings. And and so
Big deal. Big deal. Please go.
And so being able to connect the relationships, people need to find each other. There's also natural just personalities and what have you that connect. But anyway, bringing people together so that they can connect in a way that is going to work for them and amplify what they are able to do. And then also make that, as I said again, the information commons, make that accessible to everyone so that you don't have to work so hard to try and connect the dots. And and that's not that hard to do. We've actually we came across quite a number of people helping to organize people digitally. And a lot of the digital platforms kind of worked in one area but didn't work in another. And so that is one of the things we'd really like to have as a conversation is how do we bring together the stuff that will help us do what we need to do, but it's not that complicated and isn't such a, technology can be such a barrier because the people developing it get really stuck on all the cool things it can do, and what it often loses is the thing it really needs to do. And so
and it's actually a lot of our conversations have to do with, and actually why we ended up working with Joe and Penny at the design school, is there are a lot of digital platforms and ecosystems and funding and all the rest of it, and they're all talking about, they use the right language, but then none of them are actually connecting to any on-the-ground landscape leadership teams, communities, programs, and it's just abstract. So what I love about this whole tour is this is about going and meeting in person with those frontline
Hi,
communities, with the organized,
Nice to meet you.
the organizations and all the rest of it. And then all of that to say, so what is Regenerate Cascadia? So we're really focusing on 3 different things. We're trying to create a regional vision, and we want to do that through traveling around and creating, through the grassroots, growing up, creating a vision from every different watershed community that we create together for the entire bioregion, for our bioregional community. We want to also create the informational commons, which Claire has touched on. That includes bioregional frameworks, that's our inputs, our outputs, how much carbon are we producing and how much are we sequestering. And I think the beautiful thing is Vashon is such a powerful example of probably one of the most potentially bioregional frameworks you can have. It's 10,000 people living on a giant island. That island can keeps the Walmarts off, and you can't drive on, and because of that, you're already forced into a level of resilience and discussion, and it's such a beautiful opportunity to really start to have these bioregional frameworks of what does it look like if Vashon came together as an island. And then the third part, which
I just
Claire,
got a comment on that, is
Yeah.
that we're going to go to Whidbey Island soon, which is another amazing place in similar ways. And what can happen in seeing what's similar and different, because they're both big islands with very similar criteria. And it's not to compete, it's like, whoa, such strength in this region with just those 2, let alone all the San Juan Islands, let alone the Gulf Islands, let alone Vancouver Island, which is sort of like a mini continent in a way. But just to name that, that's what's so powerful about this happening in parallel and collaboratively.
and struggling with a lot of the same issues, of growth and urbanization and gentrification, and how do we live within nature, not removed from it, and how can we grow development into that so that we can create responsible societies and futures. And so all of that to be said, that the last component then that we're really building is this idea of an administrative body that can be accountable and transparent in the administration of a bioregional regeneration fund. And that's this idea of coming together to collaboratively work on funding and not competitively, not as single projects all applying for funding and then like fighting at each other through the nonprofit like industry. You know, we all know how to play that game.
Let me punch myself.
So what happens when we can come together to really actually apply for funding, and how do we kind of grow that? And then how do we create a body at a watershed, ecoregion, and bioregional level that's transparent and democratic, that's governed by the actual watershed communities and the people who actually need it, and by those communities on those front lines. And so I think that's our really big challenge of what we want to do. And so all of that to say is, yeah, it's wonderful to see everybody, and if you'd like to be more involved, definitely sign up on the email sheet that's around. And then the big thing that we have coming up is going to be that we have all of this leading into
Should you like to sign up?
Yeah.
We have a form.
an online bioregional summit, which will be November 3rd through 12th. The first weekend will really be focused on discussions and sharing and presentations from the community. If you're in this room, you're probably like connected with a cool project or doing something really cool, and we'd love to create a space where everybody can share those lessons to each other. And then during the week, we'll have themed conversations around bioregional education, community art, bioregional mapping, digital tools, regenerative finance, other things like that will probably turn into work groups further on. And then that last weekend is an opportunity for the different watersheds to come together, meet each other, and talk about what we might like to do into the future.
And that summit is free. It's not like you have to pay this big, anyway, just naming.
Oh.
Yeah, we're all working in the spirit of the gift here.
Yeah. So, and all of that to be said, that like a big part of this is also that we're only in each community for a very short window. And so we want this to be a spark. We want each place to start having these conversations and meetings, but then we also want to create space to come together in the future. If you'd like to support the work that we're doing, we're here because we believe in what we are doing, and you can buy a copy of Joe's books. All the proceeds help fund gas, and then otherwise you can go to regeneratecascadia.org.
We do snacks too.
We do eat a lot of snacks and a lot of Thai food, so it's an important part. So, all right, I guess introductions that happened earlier, so maybe we'll just avoid that. But do think about donating. All the money does go to support the expenses of the tour. And I think all of that to say that 40 years ago, on a nice sunny day in Olympia, Washington, 150 people met together to ask themselves what would happen if they took responsibility for their own actions, for their own watersheds. What would it look like? And I think 40 years later, we're just here asking the same questions. What would it take to regenerate the Cascadia bioregion? What would it take if we stood up and took responsibilities for the places we lived? So I would love for you to continue the conversation and help answer those questions. So yeah, thank you.
So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
So I know that it's almost 9 o'clock, which is around the time that we're scheduled to end for the evening. And there are some activities scheduled tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Could you speak to those, Sue?
Yeah, so we wanted to have a space to continue this conversation a little bit more as it has to do with us on the island. And Joe and Penny will participate in that as well, and Brandon and Claire. And but it's a fairly open space roundtable discussion. We have and we're going to be I think it's from 2 to 6 at the
Heights
formerly the Grange,
Right.
Grange Hall, and is now called Heights Hall. There haven't been many changes yet. There are changes in the works. And yeah, so we'll just continue the conversation there. And I think Sherry had I don't know whether Sherry's going to be able to join us. She had a little bit of a structure for it. So we'll hope to see all of you there. And I know there were a number of people that couldn't come tonight that will be there as well. And so one of the things I want to make sure is that we bring sort of a recap from this, from